In this video, we'll cover Kant's ethical theory found in his book, The Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals. This moral theory is called Deontology and is a duty-based moral theory. Our specific focus will be to understand Kant's notion of the categorical imperative. In our reading, we read two formulations of the categorical imperative, and we'll look at those here. To set us up for better understanding of Kant's theory, we'll briefly revisit Kant's concept of imperatives in general and the distinction between the hypothetical and the categorical imperatives. Then we'll look at the two formulations of the categorical imperative by way of an examination of the scenarios Kant uses to illustrate the categorical imperative. I do have a content warning for this presentation. These slides and video contain discussion of suicide and death. Imperatives, Kant tells us, are formulas for commands. Imperatives might seem like synonyms for commands. The two words are often used synonymously in our common discourse, after all. But it can be helpful to think of commands and imperatives as analogous to equations and formulas in math. So for a quick example, consider the algebraic formula for finding the slope-intercept. For those of you who can recall their algebra class. So that formula for finding the slope-intercept in algebra is y equals mx plus b. So you see, or really hear, the formula is just a bunch of letters. What's being communicated in a formula like this is the relationship between the values that will replace those letters once we have actual data or graphs we're interested in. But no matter the specific data or the graphs, if we're trying to find the slope-intercept, then we'll use this formula. So commands are like the equations we get once the formula is filled in, and imperatives are like the formulas themselves. Imperatives tell the will what must be done. Specifically, imperatives tell us what kind of actions must be done. They are the reason specific commands must be done. They link particular actions with the justification for doing or not doing them. And the will can either obey or not obey, but the will always tries to obey, because imperatives are, for Kant, rational, and the will is our human capacity to follow reason. There are two types of imperatives discussed in our reading on Kant's ethics: hypothetical and categorical. A hypothetical imperative dictates a command for an action qualified or conditioned by a specific goal. Certain conditions must be met for the imperative to arise. The particular action commanded is based on perceived consequences. In Kant's words, quote, an action is good solely as a means to something else, end quote. And that is what it means to be a hypothetical imperative. The imperatives about pursuing happiness, according to Kant, are always hypothetical. These are actions where, quote, the action is commanded not absolutely, but only as a means to another aim, end quote, and that aim being happiness. The structure of the hypothetical imperative is a conditional statement. So remember from our logic lesson that conditional statements are if-then statements. A hypothetical imperative commands that if you desire goal X, then you do action Y. Its significance is that it tells us the rules for conduct in non-moral domains. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, dictates a command for an act that is good in itself, not for some other end. It is not conditioned or qualified by any other purpose. It is not conditioned or qualified because it is universally applicable. These imperatives are laws, according to Kant, and as such, they must be followed regardless of your desires or the context. They are not concerned with results, but with intention. Its significance is that it tells us the rules for conduct in the moral domain. The first formulation of the categorical imperative can be stated as the principle of universalizability. But what the heck does that mean? Well, in Kant's words, he says we must, quote, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Is that any clearer? Or, in other words, the first formulation of the categorical imperative is the procedure of imagining one's specific action as if it was a universal law, and seeing if such a law would be compatible with other aspects of existence. So you imagine an action as a universal law by imagining what it would mean, look like, or be like if everyone has to do this action. If a contradiction emerges between what it would be like if everyone had to do this kind of action and other laws of nature or laws of reasons, then we know it is not a morally acceptable action to do. The categorical imperative names an action or a kind of action that must be done. Or, in other words, it is your duty to do it, your moral obligation. It is morally required of you to do it. What the principle of universalizability looks like when being used will help us understand Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, as well as his argument for its moral efficacy. And by moral efficacy, I mean the ability for Kant's procedure to succeed at telling us the morally obligatory things to do and justifying the status of those things as morally obligatory. We'll turn shortly to two of the four scenarios Kant addresses in the groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals. We'll look at how the scenarios illustrate the first formulation of the categorical imperative, or how they illustrate the principle of universalizability. And a little later, we'll return to them to see how they illustrate the second formulation of the categorical imperative, or how they illustrate the principle of humanity. Before turning to those tasks, however, I want to say a few remarks on the classifications of different kinds of moral duties that Kant illustrates in the scenarios. The scenarios reveal Kant's classification of moral duties into perfect and imperfect duties. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the classifications of imperfect and perfect duties, since that is not our focus currently. But a basic understanding of the distinction can help us understand Kant's moral system. So I'll say a few words about it now. Perfect duties are duties we have in all cases at all times. For Kant, our duty to not take our own life and our duty to never lie are perfect duties because we are always morally obliged to observe them. These duties are discussed in scenarios 1 and 2, and we'll cover them in a few moments. Scenarios 3 and 4, however, demonstrate imperfect duties. The imperfect duty to develop one's potential and the imperfect duty to help others in need. Imperfect duties mark moral obligations that can be met with multiple different means of fulfillment. Meaning, for example, there are options for the specific actions we use to fulfill our moral duty to help others. And we are not morally required to help them, we're not morally required to help others at all costs, but have a general moral obligation to help others in the ways that we can or when they are in dire need. And in the remainder of this recording, I will not cover scenarios 3 and 4 any further, but we will restrict our analysis now to scenarios 1 and 2 only. The first scenario illustrates the perfect duty you have to yourself. In the first scenario, which we read about on page 37 of our reading, Kant describes a person considering taking their own life. Feeling despair at a series of misfortunes, a person contemplates suicide as a way to escape this despair. Kant argues that if we pause to consider this action in terms of the principle of universalizability, or in terms of the first formulation of the categorical imperative, we'll be able to determine whether taking one's own life is morally permissible or forbidden action. Kant tells us that, in fact, taking one's own life would violate one's perfect duty to himself. This violation of duties is apparent when one follows the Kantian procedure in the first formulation. One universalizes the maxim of, quote, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when by longer term it threatens more ill than promises agreeableness, end quote. And Kant says, quote, it is seen at once, end quote, that it cannot be universalized because of the logical contradiction it produces. The contradiction is between the law of nature and this imagined universal law of killing oneself. The law of nature, as one that functions to further life, is not logically compatible with the law to destroy life. A system of nature that includes a law to destroy life contradicts itself. And because of this contradiction, we know that this action cannot be universalized. And thus we know it is our duty to ourselves to maintain life.
The procedure of scenario 1 reveals a contradiction between two concepts, the laws of nature and the imagined universal law of taking one's life. The second scenario illustrates the perfect duty you have to others. In the second scenario, Kant describes a person who considers making a promise to repay borrowed money while intending not to pay it back, or in other words, lying. This action violates one's perfect duty to others and the duty to speak one's intent, i.e., not lie, not make promises with the intention of breaking them. This violation of duties is apparent when one follows the procedure of the first formulation of the categorical imperative. One universalizes the maxim of, quote, if I believe myself to be in pecuniary distress, and pecuniary has to do with money, so we're talking financial distress, then I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know this will never happen, end quote. And this discussion is on page 39 in the reading. So imagine that's a universal law for everyone and see if it can jive with other laws of nature or logic. Now, it turns out universalizing this maxim produces a contradiction. Let's look at the scenario in Kant's own words. He says that, quote, I see right away that it could never be valid as a universal law of nature and still agree with itself, but rather it would necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law that everyone who believes himself to be in distress could promise whatever occurred to him with the intention of not keeping it would make impossible the promise and the end one might have in making it, since no one would believe that anything has been promised to him, but rather would laugh about every such utterance as vain pretense. So in other words, and that's the end of the quote. So in other words, the concept and practice of promise keeping depends upon the intent to keep the promise. If everyone were permitted to lie about their intent to keep a promise, promising itself would be meaningless. Lying in this way is incompatible with the concept of promises, and so cannot be universalized, and, according to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, is thus not a permissible action. So where the procedure in scenario 1 revealed a contradiction between two concepts, the procedure in scenario 2 reveals a self-contradiction. The very concept of promise-keeping is not compatible with making promises you do not intend to keep. For if everyone did so, not a one of us would ever believe a promise made, and promises would cease to be a thing at all.